And welcome to part 2 of Anxiety, OCD, and PTSD as part of our Psychological Disorders unit. Let's go ahead and get into it. So today we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. This is a disorder that's typically triggered by a highly traumatic event. It's marked by recurrent involuntary intrusive memories of that event and avoidance of stimuli and situations that are associated with that event. So in addition to the sort of behavioral component of this recurrent sort of intrusive memory that's impossible to put out of mind and avoidance of situations that are associated with that previous trauma, there are negative changes in thoughts, moods, and emotions, and critically a persistent physical arousal, so sort of a state of what we might call hypervigilance or hyperalertness. So originally PTSD was associated with military combat. But the definition of that has been expanded to include survivors of other extreme trauma. And not everyone who experiences an extreme trauma will develop PTSD, and there are a few factors that influence this that we'll talk about in a bit more detail. So in terms of family history, that you can inherit a predisposition for disorders like this through genetic means. Personal history, we know that lots of different events, like for example, early childhood trauma, even if that trauma is not remembered explicitly, that can influence your susceptibility to developing PTSD in response to a trauma. The magnitude of the trauma, with a more traumatic or longer lasting event being more likely to produce PTSD, and repeated trauma. So after multiple traumatic events, with each subsequent traumatic event, you are more likely to develop PTSD. Okay, so moving on to our discussion of obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD. This is a disorder which you might expect is characterized by obsessions and compulsions. An obsession is an unwanted thought or idea with which a person is preoccupied. This could be any number of things. For example, being contaminated or dirty or covered in germs might be an obsession. You're always thinking about what you've come into contact with and whether or not you are contaminated. A compulsion is a feeling that one is obliged to perform a certain behavior, even if you prefer not to do so. So a compulsion that goes along with this might be something like hand washing. You feel a compulsion to go and wash your hands over and over again, even if you prefer not to do that. Now, it's important to sort of note that OCD isn't just sort of a preference, right? You don't prefer to be clean or prefer things to be orderly. It's an obsession, an unwanted thought that's intrusive and disruptive, and a compulsion that you feel like you must complete to feel better. It's not the same as liking to have all your pencils lined up the same length or making sure that something is symmetrical because you like that. It's you feel distress if you don't. So continuing on, there is some evidence in OCD for genetic origin. We see, as we've talked about with other things, with twin studies, a greater concordance rate in monozygotic than dizygotic twins, suggesting that the more genetically similar two people are, the more likely they are to share expression of OCD. There is a deficiency in serotonin and norepinephrine signaling. We see this because drugs that increase availability of these things, like for example SSRIs, improve symptoms. There are dysfunctions in specific brain areas. So areas involved in the fight or flight response, like our limbic system, for example, are different in those with OCD, as well as the frontal lobes, which we've talked about previously as being important for things like thinking and planning and decision making, as well as the caudate nucleus of the striatum, which is important for movement regulation. So these are all dysregulated in those with OCD. So some common behaviors in those with OCD. As far as obsessions, concern with dirt, germs, or toxins, a feeling of something terrible about to happen, or a preoccupation with symmetry, order, or exactness are some common obsessions. And some common compulsions are excessive hand washing, bathing, toothbrushing, grooming, something like that. Repeating rituals, so going in and out of a door, up and down from a chair, turning lights on and off, something like that. Or checking doors, locks, appliances, brakes, homework, making sure that it's in the state that you think it's in. So a common pattern would be rechecking. Though you know that you've already made sure that that door is locked, you feel like you really ought to go back and check it again and again and again, right? It's normal to doubt, right? So if you've left the house and said, oh, did I turn the oven off? You might want to go back and check. That's not OCD, that's normal. It's that if you do it once and you're like, oh, I'm not sure, I need to go check again. Oh, I'm not sure, I need to go check again. You're going back and checking over and over and over again. That's the obsessive sort of rechecking, the compulsive rechecking. That is problematic. So let's talk about some of these anxiety disorders we've talked about from a psychological learning perspective. There's a couple of factors that underlie why these disorders kind of stick. There's the concept of classical conditioning, which would be something like overgeneralizing conditioned response, operant conditioning with principles of reward and avoidance, and observational learning, so watching others and learning from their example. And let's do some more specific examples of that. So with regard to classical conditioning, a negative experience can cause conditioned fear, right? So if you, for example, are attacked by a dog, you might learn to associate dogs with that harmful experience, and because of that, you might engage in avoidant behaviors, right? If you have a fear of a stimulus that's been associated with something painful, you're likely to avoid it. So you might have post-traumatic stress from a really, really bad dog attack, and because of that, you might avoid dogs. Or at least that specific sort of dog. And generalization also comes into play here. Generalization is when fear sort of moves from, or learning about one instance sort of generalizes to other similar instances. You apply that same principle to other things. So for example, you might learn to fear other dogs. Small dogs that aren't really necessarily harmful, you might still uneasy or afraid of because you've generalized your fear from that one specific instance to a more general kind of example. Operant conditioning. So a principle from operant conditioning might be that avoiding something stressful could produce negative reinforcement. So as a reminder, negative reinforcement means negative means that something is being removed from the situation, and reinforcement means that that behavior is more likely to occur. So in the situation of avoiding something, like let's say avoiding a dog could produce negative reinforcement, right? You are removing that feeling of anxiety because you're avoiding walking that way to work that has the dog on it, and you're more likely to do it because you're removing that anxious feeling. Likewise, with something like OCD, performing your hand-washing compulsion might remove that anxious feeling about being contaminated for a short while. So that's negative reinforcement, right? You're taking something away, you're taking away that feeling of being contaminated, and it's reinforcing. You're more likely to wash your hands again because of the relief you experienced when you did it. Another principle we should mention here is observational learning. This is when we model our behavior after what we see. So, for example, we might model a fear after observing that fear displayed by other people. So if we had a parent, for example, that was afraid of something like being in deep open water, we might avoid the ocean just because we've seen a model express fear of that, so we learn to fear it as well, by example. So let's say, for example, you had a really, really bad experience with the clown. Maybe when you were a child, you encountered a scary clown, or went to like a haunted house and had a really terrifying experience with the clown. You might have a lifelong fear of clowns. You might generalize that to all sorts of clowns, even the friendly burger peddling sort of clown. So that's an example of generalization. So then after learning that, you might decide that it's best for you to avoid any situation in which you might encounter a clown. If you potentially could, you might go the other way and avoid a situation like going to a circus or perhaps going to McDonald's, and then you feel good. That anxiety is removed as you've avoided a potentially stressful situation with an object that you fear. And that's an example of operant conditioning. Okay, that is going to do it for our unit on anxiety, OCD, and PTSD. We'll see you next time.